What secret do you only know from working in that industry? Story 1. Today's soup of the day was yesterday's soup of the day, now with rice. My girlfriend would always get the daily specials at restaurants, even when I knew they weren't things that she had a taste for. When I asked why, she said it was because she knew it was the freshest food they had in the restaurant. I had to break the news that 90% of the time the specials were things that were getting thrown the next day. I'm corrupting her to the inside scoop of the industry one dirty detail at a time. My job has a soup bar, so we straight up reheat soup, but a lot of our soups are left over from other dishes and things about to expire. I made a roasted red pepper bisque that got a lot of compliments just because that box of peppers was half moldy. That's why it irks me when I see the reactions of people finding out that Wendy's takes their extra leftover hamburger patties, freezes them, and turns them into chili the next day. That is just how most restaurant specials are made, with leftover products. I have fond memories of going on a last cruise for a riverboat. It was actually sold or retired from service. The crew knew they weren't renewing, and it was kind of fun watching them on a farewell tour with each other. The humor was with the menu. They bought no new food. Today's dessert is 2-day-old bread pudding, then 3-day-old bread pudding. The waiter was making a joke each day. Honey-baked ham from day 1 was honey-baked ham soup on day 2, and ham and eggs on day 3. The chefs were basically whipping up wacky leftovers and using what they had until it was gone. This made me remember an all-you-can-eat pizza place, which was a video rental store before and still had a few video rental store things inside, which was a clear sign to run away from that place instead of eating there, that served a flavor of pizza. Then immediately after it, the same flavor but with corn. Then the next flavor, then the next flavor but with corn. It would probably end with a corn pizza topped with corn. To be fair, it wasn't that bad. It was really cheap, and I was a broke student. The standard pizza place we usually went to at the time was 3 times more expensive. Sure, this had better ingredients, more options, and probably less chance of killing someone from food poisoning, but, well, sometimes we just needed cheap food. Story 2. The best time to buy a car is the second model year of its release. In year 1, it's patchwork to just get them off the line. In year 2, everything is fixed and has quality content. Year 3 plus, OEMs give incentives to make parts cheaper and to discontent to improve margins. That explains a lot about my wife's car. She has a 2019 VW Atlas, second year, and we don't have most of the problems other people are posting about all the time with their newer models. Spent some time with major Tier 1 suppliers here. I was directly in charge of tracking and fixing quality issues from the engineering side on several products. Quality pretty much always went up every single year from launch through the end of regular production. Yes, what we were paid also went down. Mostly this came from continuously nibbling away at process inefficiency, although sometimes we were losing money on something by the end of life and just doing it to avoid contract penalties. This gets made up for with the higher margin on new products. OEMs hate putting risk or change in field to active programs. The sort of make it cheaper even if you give something up that you're talking about almost always comes in either when the program ends normal production and switches over to service at a different supplier, or when we design the new one for the next vehicle generation. Totally agree that the first year of many programs is rough. The pandemic was a great excuse for some automakers to delete features, a lot of which had nothing to do with chip shortages. On my 2022 BMW X5, I was not able to get acoustic side glass, fog lamps, soft closing doors, or the cargo-mounted rear seat release handles, whereas the introductory model year 2019 had or offered all of those things. I have worked as an automotive supplier in engineering for 25 years. This is 100% correct. Hitting the dates is more important than quality. One example, we were instructed by the OEM to superglue parts together so they could build saleable cars. It was interior plastic seat trim, nothing safety related, but we were only one of 100 suppliers, and you know everyone else is doing something similar. If I have learned anything, it's don't ever buy Rev 1 of anything. This is only half correct. Yes, you generally want to avoid at least the first model year. However, many car models see significant improvements and/or major flaw corrections in the second half of the model cycle or later model years. And for many models, the very last model year or two are often the best ones you can buy, at the trade-off of buying a car model that is now potentially outdated in some ways to newer cars coming out, which is why car shopping is surprisingly complex and difficult. This is readily apparent from looking at many car models that have been out for a while. One example is the current Miata ND. The second round of model year ND2, starting in 2020, I think, maybe 2021, received a much better engine, and some more than minor suspension changes as well. You can see this reflected in used prices for the ND1 versus ND2. The ND3 is receiving fewer changes that I'm not as familiar with, but this is an example where a later model year is much better than even the first 3 model years. Looking back at engine and frame designs from lots of companies shows this as well. Lots of well-known engines with major flaws that are improved in later iterations. Porsche 996. Early 996 has IMS issues, and the 2002 to 2004 engines can still have this issue, but it occurs at a much lower frequency than the early 1999 to 2001 model years because of a change Porsche made. BMW S54 engines, rod bearing issues that are again less likely to happen on later cars, although they can still happen. These are just some sports car examples I'm familiar with, but this phenomenon is common. Story 3. Teachers do in fact have favorite students. This is completely understandable. The hard-working C student or the well-behaved A student is always going to be seen more favorably than the lazy or disrespectful kid. The trick is to mask your favoritism. To be honest, they can be lazy, just don't cause distractions for other students, and meh, whatever. It's sad when the kids don't care or are lazy, but so long as they don't cause problems for you, you generally don't dislike them or anything. To be honest, I can only think of one student I would say I disliked. All the others were kind of like family. You love them all, but some of them just get on your damn nerves sometimes. This is very true. I have had kids who annoy the hell out of me, but they don't cause problems, so I'm okay with them. I do remember one year when I started, 20 years ago, I had a kid who was the true definition of an a-hole. I asked my mentor teacher about him and she shrugged and said, "Some adults are a-holes, their kids are also. We have to teach them all." Always stuck with me. The most unspoken about is that we also have students that we do not even remember teaching because they made such little impact. Average work, no behavior issues. Not every student is a favorite or disliked. Some, in fact, the majority, are either fine or simply forgettable, and that is okay. It's funny this even needs to be said, but yeah, the vast majority of students are forgettable. That's not a bad thing or a knock against the kid, but it's bizarre that people think teachers should or are even able to form a relationship or connection with every single student who walks through their doors. A part of me feels bad when I can't remember a kid's name years after they left my room, but like, you've grown a foot, gained muscle, have different hair, have a more mature face shape. You were never a behavioral issue, so I never wrote you up. I never or rarely needed to contact home about you. Your work was always of average quality. You ended up with a C or B in my class. You rarely raised your hand or asked for help. You were one of the 80+ students I had that semester, one of 160+ that year, and one of 400+ since you were in my class. Give me one reason why I should remember your name, kid. I get where you're coming from, but as someone who largely got A's in college, I didn't have questions for office hours. And applying to graduate school when I couldn't get letters of rec from classes I legitimately set the curve, it was beyond frustrating. I get it. You need to make an effort to build a relationship, but at that point I'm just doing a performance pretending you're helping me so you'll remember me for a letter. If a student gets an A, just be willing to write them a generic letter and see if they still want it. Story 4. Bartenders find a discreet spot to Google the recipe for that rare drink you just ordered. My now husband is a bartender in college alongside a recent law school grad who couldn't land a job yet at a celebrity-owned bar in DC. This was before cell phones with browsers. Neither had ever bartended before and relied heavily on a copy of Bartending for Dummies kept behind the bar. A cocktail waitress once came up to look behind the bar to see if they had a bottle of neat. I was a former fancy bartender and was an absolute nerd about it. I collected cocktail books and read them all, usually with notes in the margins for possible variations. Something like, let's sub this for that and see what happens, and got to the point where I was no longer making any of these recipes and preferred having no cocktail lists at all, but rather craft customized drinks for every order. It's a lot more fun that way. But if you came in and asked for a Blood and Sand or a 12-mile limit, I knew exactly what you were talking about. On some occasions, someone would ask me if I could make a blank, and assuming it didn't ring any bells, I'd ask where they had it. Usually they'd say Amor y Amargo or Dead Rabbit or Aviary or something, to which I'd usually tell them I couldn't because a lot of their recipes use very specialized house-made ingredients, or tinctures or infusions, that I can't replicate on the fly. But every now and then, it would be something they read some amateur mixologist blog or vlog, and it was really just a Manhattan with celery bitters or something lame like that. Kids, home mixology is fun and all. Obligatory drink responsibly, or don't, live your best life, but for the love of God, read a book and follow established bartenders. And generally speaking, if they ever mention Moscato, keep looking. ETA, seriously on that last point, I've seen so many mixologists, God I hate that word, just post a recipe because it looked good. Also, maraschino doesn't taste like cherries. Back before Photoshop was a common verb, I used it on my dad's computer to make a fake Smart Serve certificate to get a bartending job. A drink Bible/dictionary was under the bar but was ripped in half, so I only had up to M. Any drink above that, I said we just didn't have the ingredients. The only martini I made got the review to my face. Wow, this is the worst martini I've ever had. I used to fill wine glasses up to the top because I didn't know any better. Got such good tips without knowing why. Story 5. I work at a milk processing plant. All milk is the same regardless of the brand. It comes out of the same tank. We just changed the labels. A friend of mine was doing some repair work at a large bakery and he was watching the bread come down the line and getting divided up and wrapped in different wrappers. So out of curiosity, he asked, "How do you know which bread gets which wrapper?" And the guy responded, "The only difference between this loaf and this loaf is about €3. Similar to a cheese plant I worked at. We would make the exact same blend for 5 to 6 customers in a row, only changing the label, then do the same thing on the next few blends. They're cheeses I see at my local supermarkets, and it's funny to see the different prices of the exact same cheese. Most products are like this, actually. I went to school with a kid whose dad managed one of the largest sparkling wine and hard cider manufacturing plants in my country. Turns out that more than half of the supermarket brand cheap champagne comes out of there. But it's not only them. Like a third of the expensive champagne comes out of there too. They just change bottle shape and labels depending on the client. It all comes from the same vat. This applies to beer too. I drive past what might be the largest beer bottling plant in the country every time I go flying, and you see maybe 8 of the 10 largest brands of beer, usually the brands that come from other countries, producing their local version of the beer there. Toothpaste does the same. I buy a cheap knockoff of Colgate toothpaste at the supermarket because I read the labels, and it turns out the knockoff and the original are produced in the same plant and have the same ingredients list. It's the same crap with a different label. Story 6. As far as I can tell, military grade means painted green. Military grade is just words. There are actual military grade standards, but unless they are specifically listed, then it is doubtful that the product has been tested to actually meet those standards. For example, MIL-STD-202 is the US military standard for electronic and electrical components parts. Test methods, and MIL-STD-461 is the US military standard for requirements for the control of electromagnetic interference characteristics of subsystems and equipment. Story 7. I don't work for Wendy's, but they actually have higher standards for their food than anyone else we distribute to. Their beef is actually never frozen, and they'll send them back if they get packed with frozen items. They turn away shipments for things like meat in boxes, touching produce in boxes, as they should, but no one else does. They send back expired or off-batch produce, like their tomatoes are usually picked a couple of days before the store actually receives them, which they should, but no one else does. I still don't eat fast food, but I like to see food quality taken seriously. I'm a service plumber, and my company takes care of all the Sonics, KFCs, and Wendy's in our area. I will say that Wendy's is by far the cleanest behind the counter too. The kitchen is clean, and their bathrooms are clean. KFC, on the other hand, is by far the most disgusting. After doing plumbing for the kids in our area, I refuse to eat there. But obviously, that's just Southern Illinois. No telling how the rest of the country operates. I used to work at a Wendy's in the 1990s. Every hamburger patty that they don't sell goes right into the refrigerator before it's overcooked and becomes tomorrow's chili. The breaded chicken that didn't get sold gets chopped up into tomorrow's crispy chicken salad. The buns that don't get sold and would be stale tomorrow become tomorrow's garlic bread, back when they had salad bars. I can say as a former Burger King employee that they are the exact opposite. It might have just been the region I worked for. I worked in 3 different locations, but they were disgusted with how they handled food. We were always instructed to push the limits with expirations. Food was always stored on the floor in the fridge and freezer, and once my manager told me to keep serving iced tea I had brewed 5 days prior, even though it was starting to mold. Story 8. Video game development is a chaotic mess. It's a miracle that any game comes out at all, let alone with any amount of polish. Also, audiences like to blame QA for bugs, but that's extremely misguided. I guarantee that QA knows about every bug in detail, including tons most players have never even encountered. The real folks to blame are management, who choose not to put resources towards fixing these bugs. Your second point is correct for QA in general. We find the craziest crap, but either upper management overrule or spineless project managers don't push back on insane deadlines. 2 questions are usually asked about QA by the bean counters. When things work, it's everything is fine. Why do we need these people? When things go bad, it's these people just slow down getting products out. Why do we need these people? Even when there are no insane deadlines, QA gets ignored. I watched a production line get shut down because there was a manufacturing error in hundreds of metal cabinets to the point that the locks couldn't be operated. The next day, the line was completely empty. Management had decided to ship them all because it would be cheaper to replace the handful where people actually used the lock than to remake the whole run. QA is a checkbox in an organization chart, not an attempt to ensure quality. I mean, this is every tech industry. At my old company, we would identify and discover bugs and then categorize them. It was all really dependent on the severity of the issue. Small bugs like your image doesn't always pop up on your photo, or you get logged out once a month randomly, were ignored. Process-breaking bugs and new features were always prioritized. Fixing bugs doesn't sell. Near the end of my tenure there, we pushed to just stop new features for like 6 months, as we had so many bugs that they were interacting with each other and caused bigger issues. But we were ignored and told to keep focusing on new features. I once had the pleasure of watching the company I worked for pull the plug on a steampunk-themed FPS with a time power gimmick that had been in test for months and was literally hours away from submission. No reason was ever given as to why they had stopped production, but it was curious given that Microsoft had announced Gears of War just before we were going to submit. Over a year later, the game came back in for testing after being completely retooled. The steampunk aesthetic was now gone, replaced with a generic futuristic look. The gruff, middle-aged military veteran protagonist, traumatized by the loss of his daughter, was now a silent scientist in a knockoff Samus suit. The game also shifted console generations from the Xbox and PS2 to the Xbox 360 and PS3. There were other changes, but those were the most drastic. Granted, it looked prettier and shinier now, but almost everything that made the original concept interesting had been completely gutted. Still, we went through, tested everything, made sure it worked, multiplayer was actually quite fun, and prepped for a showing at that year's E3. That was the year Microsoft announced Halo 3. Story 9. The difference between a professional cook and a professional chef is that cooks do weed and chefs do cocaine. I'm a professional chef. I use weed. I don't use cocaine. But something I can tell you about many professional chefs is that we don't cook at home much. We enjoy pizza, wings, burgers, and all that crap just as much as we enjoy our high-end food. But after a busy night, or in my case, after catering a 200-person wedding or something, I'm eating the extra chicken tenders I made for the kids' meals, and not the beef tenderloin and crab cakes I made for the guests' entrees. And a little secret from my industry, you'd be surprised at how much food that is served is not made in-house at places. I could build an entire menu all with pre-made frozen, canned, bagged, etc. food that all tastes fantastic, and you'd never know if I didn't tell you or you didn't see it. And all I'd need to do is heat it up and present it nicely. Most places utilize at least some products similar to this, some more than others, but it's very possible your favorite mac and cheese, soup, desserts, or even barbecue brisket was delivered pre-made and frozen on a Cisco truck and just heated up. I'm not knocking that, as there are great benefits to that, and the food is actually pretty good, though it's often salty or has MSG or the lot of fat. I've tried tons of it over the years at food shows and from samples from my vendors, and there are a few of these products I utilize, but just because a restaurant says something is homemade doesn't necessarily mean that it really is. Once again, not knocking it, because I get it, the industry is tough. This is the funniest comment I've seen all year. So accurate. I used to work as a cook at a high-end yoga retreat, and the owner brought in a few fancy chefs from Paris. There were always clashes between the hippie cooks who wanted to chant over the food and grant it special healing energy, and the chefs who just wanted the food to go out as fast as possible. Story 10. The signal strength bars on your phone don't mean anything real. Each phone manufacturer comes up with their own secret formula. It might change between software versions, and it's just a holdover from the old first-generation analog phones when received signal strength was the only important metric. 4G and 5G networks are way too complex to distill into one bar graph, but customers are used to it, so phones still have it. There's another interesting thing about cellular technology, that the poles that the antennas are on bend towards the side that is not being hit by sunlight. The metal on the pole expands on the light side, causing it to bend. As cellular is line of sight, you may have good coverage in the morning and not so good in the evening or vice versa. Also, there are some telecommunication structure manufacturing companies that take some liberties with their interpretation of the codes that apply. So they might use a lighter gauge steel on the design of the structure than what's actually required by the proper code. Story 11. Things that you buy that come in eco-friendly packaging are first removed from their regular plastic packaging and then put back into the new packaging. It's actually a double waste. The places that they get their inventory from overseas are not using eco-friendly packaging. Go to a container shipyard. Everything is shipped to minimize cost. Generally, any biodegradable plastic cannot be biodegradable unless it goes to a very specialized composting center, which is very rare. More so, biodegradable plastic that enters the recycling stream will probably make the recycling worse. I would argue that there are many instances where things have been overpackaged just for the threat of issues, when in fact, if researched and packed more efficiently, quality could still be maintained. Say a shrink-wrapped pallet of bananas, then has wrapped crates, then wrapped bunches of bananas. Depending on where it's sold or going, shrink-wrapping the pallet is enough to maintain quality and stability and protect against hazards. But are things in normal packaging also first removed from their regular plastic packaging and then put back into their new packaging? I mean, this first regular plastic packaging you mentioned, is this ever sold as is in shops without repackaging? Only partially related, but at Starbucks, everything that is given to you in a paper bag would have been individually wrapped in plastic right beforehand. The workers literally have to open the plastic package, dump the item into your paper bag, and then toss the plastic every time you order something. It's really goofy, but I think this kind of subtle greenwashing is unfortunately really common. So instead of one plastic package and one paper bag, the alternative is 2 plastic packages and bags. The former is the better option. Also, the plastic packaging in Starbucks is always going to be disposed of properly, whereas the bag given to the customer is more likely to be littered. It's much better if the litter is biodegradable. There's definitely a lot of greenwashing, but it's still a huge improvement over not caring. I don't trust any eco-friendly labels at all. I used to work in a store that sold shoes that came in eco-friendly boxes, and those boxes were packed full of crumpled up paper and cardboard that provided absolutely no structural protection to the shoes in case the box was crushed. I haven't trusted those labels ever since. If you truly want to be environmentally conscious, buy things off of Craigslist or Kijiji from local sellers. Doing so actually helps the environment because you don't spend your money on an item with packaging, and you simultaneously save an item from going to a landfill. Story 12. The massive professional quality cinema projectors that movie theaters use, the ones that can project crystal clear 4K plus images, the ones linked to top-notch surround systems that can make movies come to life, the ones so big they have giant exhaust hoses, they have regular HDMI ports on one side. The staff has totally ripped each other apart in Mortal Kombat, explored a fantasy world in Breath of the Wild, or blown away enemies in Call of Duty on the big screen when everyone has left for the night, or brought in some 4K discs and screened movies that haven't been in theaters in decades in near cinema quality, or loaded up a streaming app and watched a streaming exclusive movie in theaters. When movies were still on film, my cousin was friends with a kid who worked at a theater. One of his jobs was the night or two before a premiere. He'd have to screen the film to make sure there were no bad spots on the film. He and his friends got to see many movies before most people for free. Part of the screening process was to ensure the movie was built properly. The projectionist would get a big metal case delivered, usually 2 per movie, that contained 5 to 6 reels that needed to be spliced together in the right order. Then you would watch to ensure that a reel wasn't applied upside down or backwards, which I saw happen once. The sound played backward and the whole thing was upside down, which made the movie Hardball really memorable for us. Back in 2003, heading into my senior year of high school was the peak of Halo and the original Xbox for me. We had 2 days for football, and we had some meetings in between that made it not worth it to head home. So I organized a LAN Halo tournament for the team in one of the auditoriums of the high school. Several people brought their consoles, TVs, and power strips. I got there early and discovered the big-ass projector with the old-style connections, the red, yellow, and white style ones. I was able to connect my Xbox and project it gloriously on a 50-foot screen. The coach stopped in and was absolutely delighted to see us all hanging out and goofing around. This became a common event where a bunch of us would just head into the auditorium between practices to battle in Halo until 2 days were over. It's one of my favorite memories from high school. Story 13. The kitchen in any moderately priced dine-in chain restaurant is 75% staffed by stoned teenagers with a few journeyman cooks, barely holding it all together. And if the manager hadn't gotten notice beforehand, there's virtually no chance they'd have passed inspection. A quick note for those reading, this is not a bad thing. The higher the cook staff in aggregate, the better your food will be. Yes, one guy just obliterated will mess up your food, but a team all running a good buzz will make phenomenal food, with generous portion sizes. Y'all get noticed for inspections? The health department in my country waltzes right through the back door, clipboard out, and the camera app open on their phone. Doesn't worry me, I run a tight ship, but it's jarring to turn a corner with a hot pan to toss in the dish pit and nearly bump into someone crouched down taking photos of your drain. Story 14. Anyone giving stock advice is basically reading a horoscope. If they had the ability to pick superior investments, they'd do it themselves and not talk about it. I used to work in finance on the brokerage desk. Constantly had friends/family asking what stocks to buy to get rich. My answer was always, if I had the knowledge, why would I be sitting here talking to you? I'd be on my own private island somewhere having beautiful women bring me rum and cokes on the beach made of diamonds and rubies. I drive an '02 Accord. You think I know how to make you rich? Then I would tell them that actually I do know how to get roughly $1 million, put a few $100s into an index fund every month for 40 years. You should, depending on how much you invested each month, have between $1 and $2 million after 40 years. Reminds me of this Forex course that I took a while back. It actually dawned on me that the owners were making most of their money from just teaching the courses. If you were some kind of Forex master, why the hell would you need to teach a course? You'd make your own money, then take a vacation in the Bahamas. In the olden days, the route to wealth was a stock advisor was to incidentally be correct just enough to be a noteworthy success. Then put together some presentation on some random BS system you'd come up with and sell high-priced talks to every random investment business in town to teach them about your system. Funny enough, eons ago, there were few enough individuals making trades on the stock market at any given moment that some of these completely crazy systems actually became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The natural stock price didn't move the way the system in question said it did, but when a couple of hundred guys in New York representing 40% of the stock market's movements in an hour were all required to use that fancy new system the boss just paid for, suddenly the stock price does move the way the system said it did, because enough of the market was acting like it did, and trading accordingly. Story 15. The lumber industry is actually pretty crazy. The federal government will raise tariffs on Canadian lumber if the price starts to beat American lumber. If this happens, lumber mills will sometimes shut down for extended periods of time, essentially causing a lumber shortage. Because of supply and demand, this artificially inflates the price of US lumber. This is a never-ending cycle. All of this causes incremental increases in the price of goods. Any goods that arrive on white wood pallets, as well as building materials, start to increase in price because companies pass along this higher cost to the consumer. As with everything else that impacts goods, for everything that is transported or built with lumber, you pay for the inflated cost on a daily basis, but it's probably the last thing you think about when going to the store. My mom is a retired millwright. The only time I ever remember the mill closing down was for a strike unrelated to lumber prices in the 90s. I live on the complete opposite side of the neighboring state, where I can see the product on our shelves came from her mill. So it isn't some small mill. Not sure where you live, but in my lifetime this was not a thing where I'm from. Story 16. A lot of the TV news you watch isn't really news, just a press release from a business in an organization or a government turned into a news story. Used to work for a news clipping transcription agency. We have organizations or companies or governments calling us to say they sent some press releases to the newspapers, radio, and TV and wanted every news item that mentioned it. One local tech college changed its name after they repeatedly sent out press releases and had press scrums, and nothing they announced ever made it onto the news because no one cared. Used to get angry phone calls from them saying we weren't doing our jobs, and we would check again and tell them no one talked about them. A lot of news originates from press releases, which percentage varies extremely much between outlets, but I wouldn't go so far as to claim it's not news because the source is a press release. The problem is news organizations that just rewrite the press release without adding context, commentary, or additional sources. Story 17. Healthcare equipment costs are massively inflated in the US. For example, the batteries that go into the little blood pressure electric parts will cost hundreds to replace, but they are virtually identical to the game feeder batteries you can buy at sporting goods shops for maybe 20 bucks. And those costs are lower in other countries. The manufacturers know they can inflate costs in the US far more than anywhere else. It is cheaper to buy a replacement X-ray tube overseas, import it legally, and pay all the associated fees and shipping costs than to buy one here in the US. Same tube, same specifications. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story to these that you want to share with us, please leave it in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.